So in this video, we're going to discuss fiscal policy. We're just going to introduce the concept, describe what fiscal policy is, and talk about the tools of fiscal policy and how we go about conducting it. And then in class, we'll actually sit down with the ADAS model and see, well, what does fiscal policy look like in the ADAS model, and what impact does it have on the economy? So generally speaking, fiscal policy is simply the use of government spending, taxation, and transfer payments to achieve the goals of society. So, society comes together, it forms some sort of political structure, political organization, it takes the form of some government, and then through whatever political process they have, whether it's a democracy or a monarchy or a dictatorship, whatever it is, the government is going to collect tax revenue, it's going to spend dollars, in an effort to achieve the goals that society is deemed important. And so you may recall from our discussion on the intro to macroeconomics, when we're talking about an entire society, kind of the three big economic goals that we set for ourselves are: first, to promote long-run growth; second, to keep the economy at or near full employment; and finally, to try to maintain price stability. So not eliminate inflation, but just make sure that prices aren't rising too quickly. So with that in mind, we can start to think, well, how does government spending and taxation have an impact on the economy such that we can achieve one of those three goals? But then also remember that in addition to those three economic goals, as a society, we might choose to be concerned with issues like equity or fairness in our society, and so we may have to make some sacrifices between those economic goals and equity or fairness. And so we'll see how government can use its tools to achieve those goals. So, use of government spending, taxation, and transfer payments. And so we just want to look at each of those in detail to figure out what exactly are we talking about. So the first one, government spending, this is just when government spends dollars. This could be the federal government, state government, city, local government. It doesn't matter. Governments spend money. As we saw in our circular flow model, government, in order to do the stuff it does, needs to go out and purchase resources and purchase goods and services. So we're going to focus more on the federal level of government. And so in the United States, at the federal level, we split spending into two main categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. So mandatory spending, like its name implies, is spending that is required. That's what mandatory means, is it means you must do something. And so the reason for this is that Congress at some point has passed some law, and it is a permanent law, which means once Congress passes it, it is in effect until they come back and undo it. So Congress passes a law, and it says that we as a society, through our government, are going to commit ourselves to spending money in certain areas. And so when we look at the mandatory spending in the United States, for example, this is going to come in the form of things like Social Security. So we had a Social Security law that created the Social Security program, and when people become old, disabled, retired, we commit to providing them with that income insurance in the form of Social Security. Medicare, which provides health care coverage for old, disabled, retired people. Certain welfare programs, so food stamps, which the technical name is temporary assistance for needy families, and then just more general welfare, which we call, temporary assistance for needy families is just general welfare. Helps pay people's rent, electric bill, pay for babysitters. But then the food stamps is what we call the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So these are forms of mandatory spending. Unemployment benefits, so when people lose jobs, they can apply for and receive unemployment benefits. And then finally, in addition to all of these kind of public assistance programs, the interest on our national debt, it turns out that's mandatory just from the nature of finance. It doesn't matter whether you're the government or Mr. Kaufman. If you borrow money, you can delay paying back the principal, but you have to make regular interest payments. So all of these are forms of mandatory spending. Means Congress has committed to spending these dollars. And what that also means is that every year when Congress sits down to pass its budget, these mandatory expenditures are not part of that budgeting process. There's already a formula, there's already a law in place that determines exactly how many of those dollars will be spent. So that's our first major category of spending, is mandatory spending. Now, what that means is that everything else that the government spends money on is what we refer to as discretionary spending. And when we say something is discretionary, that means you can pick and choose, how much you're going to spend. And so that means it is subject to the annual budget process. So every year, Congress has to sit down and decide how many dollars it's going to spend on all of these different government programs and activities outside of the mandatory spending. So this is going to include everything else that government does. So this is the White House, the executive branch, and all of the various departments, that fall under the executive branch. So Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, all of those agencies of government are funded through discretionary spending. But it also means that we have to set spending for the judicial branches, so the Supreme Court all the way on down to the lowest federal courts, but also the legislative branch, so Congress, the House of Representatives and Senators. We have to fund their activities. And so when you think about what government does outside of things like Social Security or unemployment, you're thinking about the military at the federal level, or police and fire at the local level, national parks, roads and bridges. There's all sorts of stuff that government spends money on, but every year we have to sit down and choose to either continue spending that same number of dollars, or we can choose to spend more or spend less. But there's nothing that commits us to spending those dollars. So that's spending, mandatory versus discretionary. And every time the government spends a dollar, we can classify it as one or the other. Now that leads us to our second tool of fiscal policy, which is taxation. And so, of course, to have money, to spend money, you first have to acquire money. And so we saw in our circular flow model that government collects its money from two main sources, from the personal income taxes that households pay and the corporate income taxes that firms and businesses pay. So at the federal level, it really comes down to income tax. That's really a big source of revenue for the federal government that it then uses to pay for all of that discretionary spending. Now, also at the federal level, we have what we call the payroll tax. And this is just a flat rate. In the United States, it's currently 7.65%. And what this goes to pay for is things like Social Security and Medicare. And so when you get your paycheck, you'll see like at the top a gross income. And then right below that, it'll say something like federal withholding tax. And that's your employer paying your income tax for you. And then usually right below that is something that'll say something like FICA, F-I-C-A. And that basically covers the Social Security and Medicare. And so those are the two big sources of tax revenue for the federal government. The payroll tax is just a flat rate, but then the income tax, at least in the United States, is a progressive income tax, which means that the more money you earn, it's not just the more tax you pay, but it's also the higher tax rate. So currently the lowest tax rate in the United States is 10%. So all of your income up to a certain amount only gets taxed at 10%. And then as you earn additional income, then the marginal rate starts to rise. And so in the United States, the highest rate for all of the dollars that someone earns over about $415,000 is about 39%. And then there's various rates in between. So we have a progressive income tax in the United States in addition to our flat payroll tax. Now, other forms of government, other levels of government, such as states and cities, are going to rely on different forms of taxation. And the two big ones we see are a property tax and a sales tax. And these are both going to be assessed as some percentage. So a property tax is a percentage of the value of your property. A sales tax is assessed as a percentage of how many dollars you just spent, right, at a grocery store or the mall. And so those are going to be the ways that state and local governments fund themselves to varying degrees. In some cities and states, you may have both. You may have one or the other. And at the local level especially, we see a lot of different types of sales or property taxes. So, where we're having class, we may be paying a city property tax. There's a county property tax. There's a school district property tax that pays for you guys to go to school. There's a community college district property tax, Tarrant County hospital district property tax, and I think a water district property tax. So there's actually a lot of different property taxes that we pay, here in Tarrant County, on top of the state sales tax and the local sales tax. Now, two other types of taxes that we don't see generating quite as much revenue, especially as much as they used to. One would be a tariff, which is a tax on imports. And so when we purchase goods and services from other countries, the federal government checks it off and says, okay, what's the value of these imported goods or services? and they assess a tax. And that used to make up a lot more of the federal government's tax revenue, and today it makes up a very, very small share of total tax revenues. Now, the final form of taxation is a little bit different. So with income, payroll, sales, property, and tariffs, it's all assessed as a percentage of something else, so a percentage of property, a percentage of your income. But an excise tax is something that's a little bit different, and it's not based on a percentage of something, it's a per unit tax. So if you buy 1 unit of this, you pay a fixed tax amount. And if you buy a second unit of that good or service, you pay, an additional tax amount, and it's fixed. And so the best example of this that we're familiar with is the gasoline that we buy. So anytime you buy a gallon of gasoline here in Texas, you're paying about 20 cents to the federal government per gallon, and you're paying another 20 cents or so to the state government per gallon. And so when you buy 1 gallon, it's the same amount of tax as if you bought 2, 3, 4, right? It doesn't change with the value or the price that you pay for the gasoline, because we know gas prices go up or down. So it doesn't matter if the gasoline is $1 or $4 per gallon, you're going to still pay that roughly 20% or 20-cent tax to the federal government. So that covers the taxation: income and payroll taxes, sales and property taxes, tariffs, and excise taxes. Now, the last tool of fiscal policy is one that we really only see at the federal level, and it's what we call transfer payments. And this kind of combines the first two tools of taxation and spending. And in the United States, the transfer payment programs that we refer to are basically those mandatory forms of expenditures by government. So this is Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, and welfare. And the way a transfer payment works, you may recall when we defined GDP and talked about what's included, what's not included. Transfer payment simply means that somebody is collecting $1 from one person and transferring it to another. So we can talk about private transfer payments, such as when your grandma gives you $5 for your birthday, or you donate, to a charity. But what we're referring to now with fiscal policy are the public transfer payments, so Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, welfare. So those are our three tools: spending, taxation, and transfer payments. And then the next thing we want to consider is, well, when would government want to make a change to how much it's spending or taxing with respect to the current state of the economy? And so generally speaking, there's going to be two scenarios in which we may use our tools of fiscal policy to have some change or some impact on the economy. And this is going to relate back to the goals that we set for our society. So the first two goals were promoting long-run growth and full employment. So we're trying to keep output up and unemployment down. So anytime that we see ourselves, slipping into a recession when output is contracting and unemployment's on the rise, what we would choose to use is what we call expansionary fiscal policy. What we'd like to do is to stop the recession and get the economy back into economic expansion so that we can get people back to work. And the way that government does this is real simple. It can either choose to spend more money, right? It can pump more money into the circular flow. So government goes out and purchases more resources, or it purchases more goods and services. That's going to turn into more money in the pockets of firms and households, and then they'll continue to spend. Or government could reduce the taxes that it collects from households in particular. And so if we reduce income taxes on households, that leaves them with more disposable income. And with more disposable income, households will begin to spend more. And so we'll see what that looks like in our ADAS model, but generally speaking, we're going to see that the economy will start to grow and unemployment will start to fall. Now that's one scenario. The other scenario is when the economy is actually growing, but it's just growing too quickly. And we say that it's become overheated. And the risk of an overheated economy is that prices will start to rise at a rate that's faster than what we're comfortable with. So, generally speaking, we see prices inch up a little bit every year, but if they start to inch up faster and faster, then we may want to step in and use our tools of fiscal policy to try to put the brakes on the economy. Not to stop the growth, but to just kind of slow it down so that we have a nice steady growth and without too much volatility in prices. And so if government wants to do this, they're going to employ what we call contractionary fiscal policy. And so what government will do is basically the opposite of what we did with the expansionary policy. So if we want to contract or slow down the economy, government can choose to reduce its spending, right? So when it's going out to the resource and goods and services market, maybe it starts spending a little bit less. So that means firms and households are earning a little bit less income and they'll spend a little bit less. Or alternatively, we can raise taxes on households. And if we raise taxes on households, This will reduce their disposable income, and so they'll have to start cutting back on their spending. And so as a result, we'll kind of put the brakes on that overheated economy and cool prices off, so that the economy can still grow, but just at a nice healthy rate. And again, we're going to see in the ADAS model what that looks like. And so we'll stop for there. We'll go over the graphical analysis, the graphical demonstration of fiscal policy, and then there will be another video talking about some other considerations, because it's not so simple at the end of the day. There's a lot of other things we have to keep in mind, and there's some challenges we run into. But we'll talk about those in the next video.